where we discuss interesting Django topics that helps you grow, improve as a Django developer. If that sounds interesting, like, subscribe, share this video with anyone if you find this video important. Let's get into it. So, like, before I started this live, right? So I just finished recording a video on using serializers and Django API view, Django Rest Framework API views to create a functional API in Django, right? So in the tutorial, in the video, I don't think it is out, it's not out right now, right? So I was having problems with my editing software, video editing software, so I just decided to just make this video live and publish it immediately, right? So after this streaming right now, I'll publish the other video I'll be referencing in this tutorial, so please pardon me. So in that video, with the benefit of hindsight obviously now, so in that video we went through post and get request, creating post and get request with Django API views, and I mentioned that in that video that in this video we'll be looking at update and delete requests, right? So in this video we'll be looking at update and delete requests, right? So first things first, what we're going to do obviously is create our view, right? Let me just collapse this. So I just collapsed this. So let's create our view. So call this delete update view, right? Obviously we inherit from the API view, right? So just like we have always said, right? So I was always recommend going back to our serializers tutorial, going back to our API view tutorial, looking at those tutorials so that you understand what we are trying to do here, right? So first things first, we declare our delete self request, right? So this will be the function that will run whenever we make a delete request into this API view, right? Let me just add pass here, right? Then I'll write let's say this should be patch, right? Self request, then I'll say pass, right? So right now let's start with the patch request, right? So let's start with the update request, right? So when we are making update requests, we are trying to update a particular instance, right? For instance, this is our book model right here, right? I think we have two books already, two book instances saved to the database already. So when we are trying to make update request, we should be able to find out the particular instance of the query model we are trying to update. In this case, the particular instance of the book we are trying to update, right? So how do we get that? We'll simply get it with the book ID, right? The unique key, right? So for us to get the unique key, let's say we pass it from this request argument, right? We say let's say book ID, right? So this book ID will be the ID of the book we're trying to update, right? Right. So we use this book ID to get the instance of a book. When we get the instance of a book, we now update the book with that, right? So let's try to get the book. Now if we say book is equal to book dot objects dot get ID is equal to book ID, right? So if we say this right now, this will obviously get us a book. But if we hover over this will obviously get us an instance of the book. But what happens if this book ID does not exist? Let's say we have 1, 2, 3 books in our model with ID 1, ID 2, ID 3. Then a user passes in ID 5, right? What happens, right? What will happen is that this right here will throw an exception, right? And we don't want that for our API. So what we'll do here is that we'll wrap this in a try except, normally try catch, but in Python try except. So we'll wrap this in a try except, right? So when this book ID, when this book with an ID that was passed in exists, when we are able to retrieve this book with this ID, we create the instance of the book. When we are not able to do that, we return a response to our front end, telling them that hey, this book does not exist. Let's add that to this message: book with this ID does not exist, right? So obviously we can maybe add in the ID of the book here. Let's say here we say book ID, right? Let's use the Python f string if you know about that. Python f string, right? So book ID, if we spell it correctly, of course. So what it will say here is that book with the ID, with this ID space, then the ID of the book that was passed in does not exist. That's what we will return here. Then we specify the status as obviously 400 range, because this is a client bad request, right? Then we say, what do we say, 400, right? So after, if this executes, right, if this executes and gets to this block right here, it means that a book with this ID exists in our database, right? So, and we want to update it, right? So to make an update request, let's create an instance of our serializer. Serializer is equal to book serializer. Now in our, let's go back to our post request. In our post request right here, you can see that we passed in a data right here, an object of data right here, right? When we are trying to create a new instance of a book. But in this case, we are not trying to create a new instance of a book. We are trying to update an already created instance of a book, right? So in our serializer, we have a parameter here called instance, right? This instance will take in the instance of the book that we are trying to update. Let's say book is equal to this, right? So this is the instance of the book that we are trying to update. Now the data that we are trying to update the instance of a book with. So the data will be request.data. Now, why did I say request.data here, right? So request.data is a dictionary containing the request body, right? For instance, if we pass in the request body of let me say name to be book 2, and maybe description to be something else, right? So if we pass in this will be the dictionary right here, right? So after doing this, there is another property that we want to pass in. The property is partial. So when we are updating the instance of a book, right? Let's say, for instance, the front end wants to update the instance of a book. We want to update the name and not the description. Let's say, for instance, we are updating the name and not the description, and maybe the front end should do something like this: name is book 2, right? This is the only parameter we want to update. Now, if we do with what we have now, we'll have an error, we'll get an exception, right? Because the description was not specified, right? So in order for us to tell REST framework to ignore the parameters that were not specified, let's say if description is not specified, please leave the description as what it was before. If name was not specified, leave it as what it was before. Let's say in this case now, name is specified and description is not specified. So we want Django Rest Framework to ignore the description, leave it to what it was set to before this update right here. We need to pass in this partial is equal to true, right? So if this partial is by default is false, right? So if this partial is not updated to true, right, what it means is that this serializer will always expect us to pass in the name and the description. So anytime we are making a request to this API, we must pass in, as the request body, we must pass in the name of the book and the description of a book, right? So as backend developers, we want to make sure that that we are able to handle various cases of exception, right? We don't want, maybe an API can throw an exception, but we always want that exception to be exception that was self-invoked by us, like we expect it to happen, right? When maybe users are doing some malicious activities on our API, we throw an exception, right? But for exceptions that was not handled by us, of course we don't want that, because it can give problem to the front end, and our clients, our stakeholders, customers can complain, right? Get pissed off and stuff like that. So after this, right, then we call the serializer if serializer dot is valid, to make sure that this serializer is valid. If it's valid, simple and short, we still save, right? So let me just copy this, because why not? So let me just copy this right here, let me just copy it right here and then paste it here, right? So if serializer is valid, save it to the database and return this response. If it's not valid, then return this response with the serializer's errors, right? So this is our patch request, right? When we want to make an update request, we use the patch request, right? So, and also notice how we are doing everything here. Notice that we can, of course, maybe specify, say, okay, we want to make delete request, and we maybe use post request here. Of course, our code will still run. If we say maybe post here, write our logic for the delete functionality, our code will still run, right? But that's not okay. That's not professional enough, right? So we are trying to write codes that not only works but are standardized, right? Codes that other software developers will look at, understand what we are trying to do, the front end can understand what you are trying to do, and stuff like that. So what I'm trying to say is that at every point while developing API as a backend developer, Django developer, make sure that you use the right HTTP request method to handle the right actions, right? So you don't want to be using post request to handle delete request. Use get request to handle update request. I don't know how possible that is, but use get request to update delete request. So at every point you want to develop an API, make sure to ask yourself, what am I trying to do? What type of action is this? What type of HTTP method am I going to use? What do I need? And stuff like that, right? So enough of that, let's just continue, right? So delete request. So for our delete, obviously we want to also get the instance of the book. So let me just copy this, because of course want to get the instance of the book. We want to make sure the book exists. So obviously this, we want to also run this try catch right here, try except for Python, right? So we run this. If it does not exist, we return this response. If it does exist, we simply say book dot delete, right? So if the book exists, if this instance of a book exists, book dot delete, right? We'll simply delete it from the database, and that is that, right? So after that, we'll return our response and say book was deleted successfully. Book was.
Hi, fellow Django developers, Sazaka here from Django.com, where we discuss interesting Django topics to go.
So just like I told you, the other video that we just created, that was what just finished editing right here. My software was really giving me worries. That's why I just decided to make this tutorial live, so that we can still get on with stuffs. So let me change this to accepted, right? Accepted. So when the is deleted, again guys, maybe some of us will be maybe confused on why I always specify this status. It's just like what I just said. You always want to make sure you are using the right request method, the right method to handle the right action, right? Always use delete request to handle destruction actions. Use post request to handle creation actions. So always use the right status. When you are returning a server error, you use 500, right? So I think 100 is for, I'm not so sure, but 200 is for success responses, 200 range of responses, 300 is for information, 400 is for, should be for the client error, 500 should be for server errors. So always use the right status right here, the right status for the right action, for the right response, right? So if you are making a 400 response, a client error response, always use 400 range. If I'm making a 200, always use 200 and stuff like that. Also, these things also help you with SEO. I know it's not, maybe as a backend developer you might not really disturb yourself much about that, but just use it, right? Just use it. It's very important. That's what I'm trying to say. So the next thing we'll be using this in our urls.py. So if we copy this view, come to urls.py and here, then we paste this. Sorry, I have a little bit of code, right? Paste this, then we change this to, this should be delete update books, right? So we change the view action here to this and change the name because we can, of course. Then we start our server, right? That should be the next thing. We start our server. So you can see here I'm using a virtual environment. I just this is VS Studio Code, trying to start up my virtual environment for me so I can run my Python commands in the virtual environment and stuff like that. If you don't understand virtual environment, also check our tutorials. I have a tutorial on virtual environment so that you can get brushed off, right? So if we use Postman again, right? So if we make get requests, let's make sure everything is still working. This is working. If we make post request, make sure everything is still working. Everything is working. So you can see now we have another instance of a book created right here, right? So we have books with, this book has an ID of 1, this book has an ID of 2, this book has an ID of 3, right? So let's make a patch request. Let's make a patch request, that's update request, right? Let's copy this URL, change this to, this should be patch now, then specify, oh, I forgot something, guys. So in our URLs we didn't, I didn't remember to pass in this book ID, right? This book ID here, you can see if we make this request here, should tell us something like argument was not specified or something. So patch misses one required position argument, book ID, right? That's because we did not specify the book ID in the URLs right here, right? So this is an integer. Again, these are just basic Django stuffs that I have a playlist on Django, right? I'll also leave a link to it in the description so that maybe you can look at it and stuff like that. But I'm guessing you probably know this. So this is just passing arguments to this request view right here, just passing this book argument, right? So that's what we're doing here. So if we go back here and specify the book ID, so like let's make get request again, sorry, should be this. So if we make get request here, you can see we have ID1, ID2 and ID3, right? So but if we should make let's use ID5 for instance, right? So if we use ID5, you can see book with this ID5 does not exist, right? Because no book in our database with this ID5, right? So but if we should change this to, let's say 2, right? And make this request, you can see book was created successfully. Let's change this to book was updated successfully, because it was not created, it was updated. Book was, where is that book was updated successfully, right? So our server is running. So if we go back, make this request, you can see book was updated successfully. So let's make a get request. If we make a get request here, to make so that we'll make sure that this works, right? If we make a get request here, you can see the book ID to the name of the book is first book, so let's change it to second book, right? So if we come here and book ID is 2, then we'll change this to patch, then in the request body we'll change this to second book, right? If we make this request, you can see book ID was updated successfully. Now let's make the get request again. If we make this get request again, you can see that the book name has updated to second book, right? So our patch request is working very well. So let's make the next one should be the delete request, right? So the delete request, so the delete request, so we are deleting book with ID 2, right? So if we do that, book was deleted. If we make get requests to get all the books again, if we do this, you can see book was deleted, book ID 2 has been deleted, right? So that's it basically for it. So we now have a functional CRUD application, right? You can see we have the create here, we have create here, which is used to create books. We have get here, which is used to read books. We have update here, which is used to update instance of a book. Delete here, which is used to delete an instance of a book, right? So let's create a book, update a book, read the book, and delete the book, right? So let's just create a book right here quickly. So we create another book with ID 4. Let's read this book. So we are able to read, this is the book. Let's delete, let's update first before we delete. So book with 4, let's say fourth book. So this has been updated. Let's check if it did. Let me change this to, so if we do this, you can see fourth book. Now let's delete it, and hopefully that works also. So book was deleted. Let's make a get request. Book with ID 4 has been deleted, right? So this is like the basics of every API. Like this is where every API springs up from, right? So if you have any question, if you have any queries, leave it for me in the comments, leave it for me. I will always get back to answer you. If you can understand this, if you can follow these tutorials, I'll also leave a link to the GitHub repo for this our tutorials, so that you can go through it and learn better. If you can understand these 2 tutorials, the one I will upload soon and this one right now, I will say you are more than 50% done. You have more than 50% a backend developer, right? So in the next tutorials, from the next couple of videos, we'll be looking at authentication, right? Because that's the next step. If you understand this, understand the authentication, you are a backend developer, right? You just have to practice, work on projects and stuff like that. And of course, that's our target. That's my target. That should be your target. That's what all of us are working towards, right? So that we will all become better Django developers. If that sounds interesting, like, subscribe, share this video with anyone if you find this video interesting, and have a nice day. Take care of yourself. Peace.